fortunate. Holden has been my mentor for very, very long. He's today the editor of Science, the Family Science Foundation, not foundation, sciences. But I was very fortunate that he was my chancellor when I was at UNC. So he was one of the youngest people in the history, I think, to be a chancellor of a university here in America. Then he was my provost when I was at Washington University. So he was a chancellor, a provost, now he's the editor of Science. He's an entrepreneur, he's a musician, he's like, you can go on and on. He's really amazing, and now he's doing this really important work on neurodiversity. So I'm so fortunate that you agreed to come and join us here, and everyone is very excited to hear it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you, McCall. It's really great to be here. Master class on autism genetics just now. So since that's one of my fixated interests, I was completely riveted the entire time, and two great talks before that. So this talk is going to have no original data in it. I'm not an autism researcher. It'll have data from people like Thomas and his colleagues and competitors around the world. But I am on the spectrum, as you may have already deduced. I will have a very hard time not looking at those 6 panels back there because they form a pattern, and visual patterns are very hard for me to not to fixate on while I'm giving you a talk, and you'll notice from my body movements and other things. And I'll tell you the story of how I got my diagnosis and all that later in the talk. But as I've gotten into this, what I've found is that, there's so much confusion out there among people who are autistic and don't know, or they have a loved one that they suspect is, and they don't know how to deal with that. And once I publicly disclosed that I was on the spectrum, I started hearing from all kinds of people. The most common thing, and I'm sure Thomas would say the same thing, is my child was diagnosed with autism, and I think I'm autistic myself. But I also hear, my kid in high school has just gotten a diagnosis, and I don't know what to do about that, or my spouse or my coworkers told me that I had all these autistic traits, and I don't know what to make of this, and they go online and they just see all this total confusion. And so I'm kind of on a mission to help the people in that category get the right balance and collection of information so that they can understand how to make decisions for themselves about what's best for them, or make decisions for their loved ones. And I'm going to have a book out a year from April, I hope, if I make my deadline, that will be, hopefully, has a chance of being very widely distributed, given who the publisher is, that I hope people will grab when they're autism curious, to try to help them sort out how they can continue to, how they can optimize their impact on the world and their thriving, and hopefully lead many of our organizations, because if we have autistic leaders, then they will be better at adapting the workplace for neurodivergent people, and also optimizing the things that autistic people can do, like look in places where neurotypical people aren't looking, which sometimes allows us to see threats and opportunities that other people don't see, and systemizing and all the things that you heard about earlier. So this talk is kind of a mix. It's the general structure of what I would give to a general non-scientific audience, just so you can see how I make my case, but then I have a few asides for you all to work on the science that you're doing. And so, the kind of people that I will say a lot about people who have more severe impairment today, because it's very important that my end of the spectrum be completely deferential to the people who are taking care of kids who are self-injurious, and to people who have to make their way in the world with much more conspicuous disability than we have. But my main pitch is for people with what we would call level 1 autism, or what was it? Cluster one. Yeah, cluster one in Thomas's talk. And so this is kind of how I usually lead my talks off with this. Right, these are my people here. It says, man's heart stops as speaker asks audience to turn to the person next to them. All right, we really don't like this, okay? We're like, oh God, why did I come to this? And the next thing you know, there's a breakout group and you're just trying to figure out how to go to the bathroom and stay there. And I'm also a huge fan of Lorna Wing, just like Thomas is. I never got to meet her. But when she described Asperger's, she had 5 traits: fixated interests, as apparent lack of empathy, as I'll get to. That means low cognitive empathy, high affective empathy, difficulty making friends, clumsy movements, one-sided conversations. That generally means we like to give monologues about our fixated interests, and we don't realize that people are bored by that. I think the other big thing here, so even in one of the earliest papers about autism heritability, though, 25 years ago, John Constantino first noticed that lots of people in the families of the children that he was giving diagnoses of greater impairment to also had autistic traits. And he said, given the continuous distribution of these traits, it may be arbitrary where cutoffs are made between research designations of being affected versus unaffected with a pervasive developmental disorder. Lorna Wing told Steve Silberman, Asperger's shades imperceptibly into eccentric normality. All right, so one of the biggest conflicts we have in the autism world right now is whether people in my end of the spectrum, whether we're autistic or whether we're just eccentric people, and what we're entitled to from the designation that we have, and more importantly, what would actually benefit us, which maybe is not very much. And so this is the thing that I'm mostly helping people try to process. All right, well, given the audience, I thought I would start with the first documented Asperger's person. Sam Levine is a rabbi and a law professor who wrote a book about Joseph and whether he was on the spectrum. And I could give the whole talk about this, all right, but given where this happened and how long this has been here, this is the easiest way to make a case that it's nothing new to have autistic people around. So if you think about Joseph, what he did was he goes to his brothers. He's having a hard time interacting with his brothers, all right? He tells them a dream about how great he's going to be. They get really mad at him. What does he do? He goes and tells them another dream, okay? If you had cognitive empathy, you would not go tell him the second dream, okay? He's easily deceived, right? Because Potiphar's wife ends up basically tricking him into ending up in jail, but he has a strong moral compass because he never gives in to her in reality. And so he'd rather set himself up to go to jail than betray her oath to Potiphar. All right, he ends up being a great number 2 guy. Maybe I always say the greatest provost in human history is Joseph. And why? Because the Pharaoh understands that what he needs is his unbridled support. And the Pharaoh's not giving to them that because he is a super compassionate guy. It's just that he's realized how talented Joseph is, and if he gives him his unbridled support, he's going to be able to do just one bang-up job running Egypt for him, all right? Why I love McCall? She tells me she loves me like every 15 minutes, okay? So I never spend a second wondering what's in McCall's mind about what she's thinking about me, all right? So, and Pharaoh does exactly the same thing for Joseph, all right? Now, but the effective empathy is there because he forgives his brothers in the end, all right? And his father also has some autistic traits because Jacob is easily deceived when he's trying to get Rachel. He's easily deceived again when he comes back to Egypt and, he thinks Benjamin is in trouble. And a number of other things with Jacob. So he's got a father with autistic traits. He's got all these autistic traits himself. And so this may be the first documented case of a person with level 1 autism. All right, but to document it more carefully, this is a colleague that Thomas mentioned who has a test which is imperfect and it's out of date, but it's widely available on the internet and it's been given to millions and millions of people. And it's a test that measures whether you have autistic traits or not, which is not the same thing as having an autism diagnosis. I got a 40, which is solidly in the you're probably autistic range. And when I asked Simon, what's the biggest surprise about this, he said, no one's ever gotten a 0. So the millions of people they've given the AQ to, no one's ever gotten a 0. So congratulations, you all have autistic traits, all right? And this explains the challenge in this whole thing because, okay, I got a 40, that's a pretty unambiguous score, but if I got a 25, well, I still have a lot of autistic traits, right? And so there's just no clear way to delineate this. And if you've never been to the high table with Simon, I highly recommend that. And so as I'm trying to understand this, I interviewed a lot of people. And one of the moms that I really like a lot is somebody named Carrie Cariello. She has a son, Jack, who would have gotten a PDD-NOS diagnosis. He's autistic and he has some intellectual disability and he had a speech delay. But he's now living in an apartment building with all other autistic people. He's going to graduate from college by going to community college, and he's got a job in a grocery store. So I said to her, Carrie, look, and he loves to talk about airplanes. I said, I'm very different from your son, but we're similar in that he likes to go on long monologues about airplanes, and I like to go on long monologues about jazz music and autism and chemistry and the things that I'm really fixated in. And she said, yeah, the difference is you're capable of understanding that you're boring people, and Jack is never ever gonna understand that, right? And so his intellectual disability makes a big difference between the profile that he has and the profile that I have. Now, I still have a hell of a hard time not going on my autistic monologues or looking at that pattern of whatever those are back there, sound things. But I know that I'm supposed to make eye contact with people and that I'm, in a conversation, I should listen more. So the intellectual ability to comprehend that is a huge part of this. And John Constantino said, yeah, of course, because intellect derives many, the ability to adapt to a significant load of autistic traits, right? So, as you've heard, the intellectual disability is very important. But again, autism always frustrates you because this is a famous guy you may have heard of named Hari Srinivasan. He's not the one on PBS. He's a different Hari Srinivasan. But he's about to be the first nonverbal autistic person to get a PhD. And here I am trying out his system. He's built this virtual reality system where you pop bubbles, and that allows you to measure your interpersonal space. And autistic people have smaller, Thomas showed me a note today from somebody who said they stuck to people like Post-its, right? Because our sense of interpersonal space is different. And you can measure that with Hari's thing. He's going to be the very first non-speaking autistic person to get a PhD. So you can't say, oh, well, somebody who can't speak has, profound autism, because here's a guy who can't speak, but he can do all these other things, all right? And this goes back to I think, absolutely visionary paper by Neil Risch that showed that, and this is one of the things I explain to a lot of moms and other autistic people who can't understand all this. Neil was able to find autistic siblings who had the same overall severity of autism measured by some instrument. But the actual collection of traits they had, even though they were siblings, even though they both had the same severity, was different. So one might have more repetitive movements and the other one might have more of some other trait, fixated interests or stimming or something like that. So this is why Stephen Shore, who you've already heard about today, said if you've seen one autistic person, you've seen one autistic person. That's not just a slogan. There's a scientific basis for that, all right? And this is why there's so much confusion in whether somebody who can make eye contact but has meltdowns at home every night that nobody sees could be just as autistic as somebody else who can't make eye contact, but has some other traits. And this drives a lot of the disagreement that we have in this. Now this is another paper similar to the one that you just heard about from a different lab that did a very similar study to the one that Thomas described, where they were clustering genes in the GWAS, and similarly, they found 4 clusters instead of 3, but those clusters, just like the ones you heard about, you have one for moderate challenges, one for broadly affected, one for social and behavioral. This is like with a lot of other co-occurring psychiatric disorders, and this is one that's with a speech delay. And you can look at all the kinds of things you've been looking at all day today, distributed across these various things. But you see, particularly intellectual disability, 2 of the categories way over here, and the moderate challenges, which are these people who have polygenic profiles. They're over here, and they don't score very high on intellectual disability compared to these other 2 categories that were way over here. But the important thing, for a general audience, whether there's 3 clusters or 4 doesn't really matter, but you can absolutely see the subtypes of autism in the GWAS. Okay. Why did my clicker die?
Maybe try from the computer.
Yeah, I don't care about that.
I think you tried in the computer and then went back to work.
Oh.
It's totally stuck.
Okay, well, all right. So here's another paper with a lot of names you've already heard, Thomas and Simon Baron-Cohen and Varun Warrior. This one shows similar thing. If you take people who are diagnosed early and late, you get different genetic profiles for them. So the point isn't so much, like if I'm talking to a general audience, they sometimes get lost in this. But the only point I'm making is you can see multiple genetic types within the genes. But remember my conversation with Carrie Cariello, she also agreed that her son's fixated interests are on a continuum with mine, right? So you have this bizarre dichotomy that drives a lot of the disagreement in autism, which is the traits are on a continuum, but there are clear subtypes in various biological signatures, including the genetics, but also the brain imaging and stuff like that. And so that's a really important fact that a lot of people struggle with. Now, if you're autistic, this isn't that hard because we take everything literally. So for both of these things to be true is no big deal for us. But for a lot of moms, for example, of autistic kids, they want to believe the second part, but not the first part, right? They want to believe that their kid, if they have a lot of impairment, has a different disease from me, right? And then if you're in the neurodiversity rights group, you want to believe that all autism is the same. Your autism is no different from the autism of people with greater impairment, and that it's ableist to think that that isn't true. And this is like as you all do your studies, this is the interface that you're going to have a lot of challenges with. Now, another couple other things, no one gets a 0 on the AQ. The profiles show up in the genetics. This is another one that's hard for the profound autism moms who are activists. that Asperger's or level 1 autism or cluster 1 is real. That we're not doing this just because we want to join the autism community or because we're trying to get accommodations that we don't deserve, at least for the most part, that we can't predict the trait profile from the overall severity, and that intellectual disability is a crucial parameter. So these are the things that I find to be the scientific points that I like to try to get across to a general audience. All right, and so the fight over what the real autism is Asperger's or C1 or level 1 autism, is that the real autism and everything else is autism with an intellectual disability, with a speech delay, or is only level 3 autism with self-injurious behaviors and nonverbal, is that the real autism? And the rest of us just have a lot of autistic traits, and maybe we have some other psychiatric disorders to go with it. All right. The advantage of the first one is that if I'm on the spectrum, that lowers the stigma for everybody because I'm the editor of Science and I'm able to do all this stuff, and same thing with Bill Gates and whoever. So the people who favor this say this lowers the overall stigma. The people who favor this say that it provides greater respect for the people who have the greatest needs. And there's advantages and disadvantages of believing both. Of course, what I would like to do is just forget about all this and try to help people as much as we can. But it's hard to get past this when you're getting into this. So for the people that are just coming to autism, I feel it's important to explain this to them and say, most people with autism are not in this fight. They're just trying to get by day to day, and you get to do that now too. But here's the kind of thing I get from the neurodiversity rights side. I wrote a piece that said, I have a form of autism that means I don't have an intellectual disability. And, I get, you don't have a form of autism, you're autistic. And, it's evil for me to try to separate these things. All right, so this is the kind of thing you can easily get on social media. If I think everybody in this room, if you don't know about it, would love listening to this podcast, The Loudest Girl in the World, by Lauren Ober. She's hysterically funny. She does a great job of explaining what it's like to get your diagnosis late in life. And she says something profound about this very thing, which she says, on the one hand, autism fails as a word because it's charged with doing way too much. It's charged with describing me. It's charged with describing Elon Musk. It's charged with describing kids who are banging their head against the floor. But at the same time, for her, it's what she calls the word that deletes all other words, because she's struggling with all these things from her life. People say she's difficult, she's picky, she has very strong, powerful sensory challenges, and she's always trying to sort these things out. And one day when she gets the word autistic, she has a way to explain all of that. And that was a huge relief to her. And it was to me as well. So you have this weird thing where you're trying to, the things you all are working on to try to make sure the right people get an autism diagnosis. Lauren Ober and I don't really need much from our autism diagnosis except knowing that we have it. There aren't really services that are going to help us. So you don't want to overdiagnose people. But some of the people that could be said to have been overdiagnosed are the very people who'd benefit from just the diagnosis itself, right? And so this is another very complicated thing to work out. So to me, this boils down to 4 things that I'm going to come back to at the end with my model, kind of like the one you saw earlier, which is asking, okay, first of all, when can and should autistic people push ourselves to integrate into the neurotypical world, right? Should all of us try to make eye contact all the time and not fidget and put ourselves in social situations that we find challenging? The answer to that is no. Some people should push themselves more than others, and the amount that you can push yourself changes over the duration of your life. So if we could use science to answer this question for people, we could make the huge improvement, right? Because individualized therapy is too expensive and it's not going to scale, all right? The second is, so you heard about camouflaging, masking is kind of more the trendy term for it. When should we be expected and when is it best for us to mask our autistic traits? A lot of us can do it, but we're very exhausted and worn out when we try. And then how much should the neurotypical world adapt to accommodate us? And the good news is a lot of those adaptations would make the world not just better for autistic people, but better for everyone, right? So I really struggle filling out forms on the internet. Well, actually nobody, enjoys filling out forms on the internet, right? So, the difference is I might get in the middle of one and just end up crawling into a ball on the floor, and some of you can persist through it. I get my wife to fill out a lot of my forms. And then finally, how do we, as I've been saying, none of this works unless we can maintain respect across the spectrum. All right, so how am I doing on time? Okay, so I've met a lot of the famous autistic people. Temple Grandin, I'm sure you know who that is. If you haven't watched the movie where Claire Danes plays her, it's pretty realistic, and Temple is always telling me how accurate it is. And this is John Robison, who wrote a book called Look Me in the Eye, which is the biggest selling autism memoir. It sold 500,000 copies. John Robison made the exploding guitars for Kiss, and then he went on to start a very lucrative business repairing highly expensive cars. All right, and Temple Grandin, of course, created handling equipment for cattle. And so both of these people are people who've used their autistic traits to be successful, who have pushed themselves into the world. And the other thing that I would suggest to you do is watch a YouTube of Temple 30 years ago giving a talk and watch one of her now. She's making a lot more eye contact. She's a lot more fluid now than she was. Same thing with John. You can watch tons of stuff about them on YouTube. They both had, Temple had a speech delay, John a very minor speech delay. So they have, they might be in cluster 2, but they are still both very strong proponents that every autistic person should push themselves into the neurotypical world. All right, but Temple had amazing support from her parents. John Robison is financially successful. He had more of a challenging childhood. And some people in the neurodiversity world would say they're ableist because they're pushing everybody to integrate, all right? But that's their view. This is a guy named Dave Caudell who is at the Frist Center for Innovation and Autism at Vanderbilt, which I'd encourage you to learn more about. And he works a lot on helping autistic people get employment. And he's a really, really good coach. If I had an autistic kid who was having a hard time getting a job, I would want Dave to be their coach. I said, Dave, how do you do it? He said, I push people to do a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and then I pull them back. It's bend, don't break, all right? And that makes sense. The problem is you gotta have Dave for your coach in order to achieve this. So if y'all wanna figure out another scientific problem, how do you get this from technology? If you could do that, then you could scale autistic employment much more than, you're never gonna get there with individualized therapy because you're always gonna miss people and you always have people who don't have resources, who can't navigate the healthcare system, who aren't gonna get that. So Temple and John want to push people a lot. Dave wants to bend, don't break. And Simon's like, oh, you better be careful because there are a lot of autistic people that if you push them at all, they're gonna get so overwhelmed that they may end up regressing. So again, this is like, how do we get tools that help us figure out which one of these things is right, right? If we had that, we could help a lot more people that we don't have. All right, now we move on to masking. So there's a famous book called Unmasking Autism. If you want to learn about women and girls, I highly recommend that one. It's all about how, as you just heard, girls are underdiagnosed, and that's probably a mixture of the science and the fact that girls are better at masking than boys are. And when if you fix the over-masking problem, would you get to 50-50 with girls and boys? I don't know. What do you think?
Still boys will be...
Yeah, I think there's still some biological thing about boys. Yeah, I've never talked to John Constantino agrees with you. I've never talked to hardcore researchers who didn't think that there was some biological factor with boys, but there's certainly some that relate that's social. Unmasking autism is all about how the toll of masking and how we shouldn't have to do it. The only reason we have to mask is because we live in an ableist culture that expects us to make eye contact and not fidget and all that. I'll come back to Devin Price, who wrote that, but they're one of the leading neurodiversity rights activists. All right, so then finally the neurodiversity movement itself, at least part of it is, what if we didn't have to mask at all? This is the book that really kicked this off by Steve Silberman. Goes through the whole history and kind of talks about the existence of lots of us who are autistic but wouldn't have gotten a diagnosis a long time ago. And I had the opportunity to interview Steve one time before he died. He died tragically, 2 years ago maybe? And he was also famous deadhead. So I don't know if we have any deadheads here, but if you talk to a deadhead about Steve Silberman, they'll go off on another philosophical thing about what amazing scholar he was of the Grateful Dead. His main goal, and he told me this the one time I interviewed him, was to have more autistic people involved in the research, and we've been talking about ways that you all can do that. All right, so then we get to the double empathy problem. This is what happens with the difference between cognitive empathy and effective empathy. All right, your facial expressions and your body language are not telling me very much. All right, but once I know what you're feeling, then I can connect with you. All right, and that's why I love it when people give me unambiguous signals, because I can spend all my time plugging into my effective empathy and not sit there torturing myself, wondering what it is that you're trying to tell me. All right, and the upshot of this, so I meet people all the time or have lots of people in my life who say, when I first met you, I didn't know what to make of you, but then something big happened to me and you were like the first guy who showed up who wanted to help me. And that goes exactly with this, right? I started a new work partnership with somebody the other day, and after my first call with her, I got a note from her boss saying, "Why were you mad in that meeting?" All right, this happened to me a week ago. All right, so this is a very real thing. Noah Sasson is an excellent researcher at UT Dallas who studies the social side of this. He published this paper that shows that neurotypical people form opinions about autistic people within seconds of meeting us. All right, and so that's why this is such a hard challenge. But the idea of the double empathy problem is that solving this is a two-way street. We have to recognize that people have a hard time perceiving us, but we deserve the opportunity for people to realize that our mannerisms don't come across the same way that they expect. And so lots of the social literature is based on this double empathy problem. Right, I'll tell you a little bit about my story. Here's me as the nerdy, quirky kid who is holding a bag of basketballs because I'm the manager of the basketball team, not on the basketball team. I read at 2 years old. I was a terrible athlete. My mom ran the theater in my hometown. She fired me as an actor when I was 12. So if you've never been fired by your mom, I don't recommend that. But fortunately, I could fix everything at the theater. I was a strong student, missed nonverbal cues, tons of fixated interests. I had a small number of close friends, and as we heard, when plans change, I have a really hard time, and I have a hard time leaving projects in the middle. Now, I believe I was better off in the 1960s without a diagnosis. Couldn't have gotten one anyway. But I had supportive friends, a supportive family, I had resources. I had no problem finding my people, and I definitely didn't need a diagnosis then. Now, if I'd been bullied, if I didn't have resources, or if I was in today's world where I was isolated online, I very well could have benefited from getting a diagnosis. And this is, again, this complexity here. There's a lot of ADHD in the siblings of autistic people. You know that when you look at the SPARC database or the UK Biobank. My brother repeated the first grade. And so he certainly would have been diagnosed with ADHD in today's world. He's now a venture capitalist who has $1 billion under management, and he went to Harvard. And so he managed to recover from that. Again, he had resources, he had a supportive family, he had all those same kinds of things. But it's very common to see autism and ADHD in two siblings. All right, these are the friends that I had growing up. I went to a small Catholic school where we just had 30 people per grade. This is my best friend, Nick Robinson. He got a 3 on the AQ, which is the lowest score I've ever heard. But here's me, of course, I'm the one with the movie camera. And I'm thriving in this interaction because he's telling me what other people are thinking, and I'm making him the star of a movie. And these are all our classmates, and this is us just a few years ago in our 60s, still together. And if I hadn't had all these people, I very well could have needed an autism diagnosis to have thrived, right? So luck is incredibly important in this, and I was lucky enough to have all these people in my life who thought I was a wonderful goofball. And if you haven't watched it, this is a show, Carl the Collector, about this very thing that's on PBS Kids. Carl is an autistic raccoon, and these are all of his neurotypical friends, and they're all navigating the double empathy problem and all this stuff. And there's a whole season worth of these videos. I would encourage you, you can enjoy them if you're not 5. And if you have a 5-year-old, you definitely should watch this with them. It's really a beautiful and heartwarming program. And we just added a second autistic character who's nonverbal and has an iPad and uses that to communicate. So we're excited about that too. All right, so in young adulthood, again, I had resources, I had support in childhood. I was a chemistry professor, so that's a pretty good place to be if you have autistic traits. I got very interested in why people study things, and you noticed all the questions that I've been asking you about what you're working on. So that helped me learn to fix things in the university. And I fit the autism stereotype in every possible respect. I was the first person to solve the Rubik's Cube on national television. This is me right here on That's Incredible. But like Joseph, I married a very neurotypical wife. I didn't have the Pharaoh to get her for me. But my wife is the complete complement of me, understands everything that's going on in the world. And I get out graph paper and solve problems for her anytime she has one that needs solving. My kids wondered why I used to watch the TV without turning it on. And I've had teaching evaluations my entire career until now that said I could have more fluctuation in the tone of my deliveries. But again, I wasn't really struggling here. I mean, I had my people. I probably still didn't need a diagnosis. I'm going to skip that because we're going fast here. But then I became the chancellor of a major university in the South that played football and had fraternities and had stockbrokers and people like that as the influential alumni. And so I had a lot of challenges, and I didn't have a diagnosis. And my leadership profile at that time was a lot of people telling me, I tried to tell you that. Multiple people told me things, and I couldn't figure out how to make them go together. When I was at a cocktail party, there would be people lined up trying to talk to me because I couldn't end a conversation with each person. Or if I went to a dinner party, there were people, I get the complaint that, oh, you talked to the person on your right the whole night and you never talked to the person on your left. And then when I got in a really tough situation, you can see like my affect that works is when I'm being very sincere and using deadpan humor and not getting that far away from my traits. But when I got in a position where people wanted me to perform as a sort of commanding politician, I was unable to do it. I got a bunch of coaching on how to do it, and it only made it worse. If people come to me with a problem, I'll fix it even if they don't want me to. And then I have another challenge, which makes me a bad university president, which is if somebody who doesn't know a jack about what they're talking about comes and tells me about some problem at the university and how to fix it, rather than going, oh, that's a very interesting idea, which is what most of my peers will do, and then try to never actually do it, I'll go, let me explain to you why that's not going to work. All right, and if somebody gave you $10 million and you treat them that way, they don't really love it. So eventually I ended up leaving the University of North Carolina, but at the same time, there are a lot of people in Chapel Hill who love me.
They were devastated. I was there.
Yeah.
Devastated.
Are you out here, McCall, in this picture?
I'm not there, but
Yeah.
I left a year before you, and I remember all the emails that everyone was
Yeah.
so devastated when you
So here's the rally for me when I left.
It was you. But
Yeah. Little did you know I was coming to be your provost.
exactly.
Yeah.
I went a year before you.
Yeah. So I went to nerdier school that was in Division III. I had a lot of problems with athletics. I was, like Joseph, I became the provost, not the chancellor. And I had a pharaoh who was unbridled in his support for me and McCall and everybody else. Most of my sort of blunt, straight shooting was stuff people liked. But I had a 360 review that a lot of executives have, and in it, my coach said, some people have said they think you're on the spectrum, and I agree. And she was qualified to tell me that. So suddenly I had, I never had a whole workup with the ADOS and all that stuff, but I had somebody who's highly qualified to tell me that she thought I was on the spectrum. She said when she first met me, I was constantly looking just a little bit past her. And she said, when I do coaching, I usually don't like to give people a diagnosis, but I just thought in your case this was so stark that I had to tell you. And also people noticed that I had a lot of PTSD about all the crap that happened in North Carolina. And so all these things go together, as we've been able to hear. So I had a diagnosis, but I didn't tell anybody for the time that I was there. Then when I got to science and figured out I was in my last job, I started meeting all these people. And I just gradually started telling people, like I told my class at the first class, you're going to notice my vocal tone doesn't modulate very much. Well, that's because I'm on the spectrum. And turned out that worked pretty well. Then I started telling my friends. Then my daughter got her MSW, and one of the things you have to do is do a differential diagnosis of your family. She probably wasn't supposed to tell me, but she told me she came up with ASD. She won't tell me what she came up with for her mother. I really would like to know that. I hadn't told her that I had a diagnosis. So then I started learning the lingo and how to talk to people about stuff. And then after I met a lot of these people, I decided to disclose my diagnosis. And I would say the impact of that is that it actually has lessened the stress that I feel from a lot of my symptoms even more. But as I tell people, I'm 61 years old, I'm financially secure, I'm in my last job, and so you can't just judge from me that it's a good idea for you to disclose your diagnosis, because there's still so much stigma out there. But for me, again, this is kind of the luck thing. I've benefited from that. All right, now let me just kind of lay out what I think this has all taught me. And the first one is, this question of how much should autistic people be expected to integrate themselves in the neurotypical world? So you can find a lot of research that'll suggest that autistic people are much more comfortable with other autistic people, all right, because we can talk about our fixated interests and nobody cares, and nobody's expecting us to make eye contact, and it's just like any marginalized identity. When you're not having to stand up for your identity because you're in a homogeneous group, it's kind of a relief. And there's lots of data that support this. And for some people with some profiles, that's what they need. Like Carrie Cariello's kid can live in a home, in an apartment building with other autistic people, but he wouldn't be in a good shape if he went to a regular apartment building with neurotypical people. Then, of course, you have John Robeson. Here he is with Ace Frehley, and Temple Grandin saying, you know, these kids need to get good jobs, they need to get out in good lives, they need to do things. I see way too many parents babying their kids, 16-year-olds who've never gone shopping by themselves. All right, and for a lot of people, this is correct. And for a lot of people, it isn't. And that's the challenge we have. We really don't have a sophisticated way to locate people on this continuum or to move them on the continuum as their traits evolve over their life. So, you know, can technology help determine alignment of the traits and goals? Well, here's something I saw at Vanderbilt. This is a rig to teach autistic people how to drive. I drive, but I'm a bad driver. And you know, most people say they're a better average driver. I'm one of the people who doesn't try to say that. But a lot of autistic people can't drive at all, and this is a simulator where the program is rigged, you know, so that, because the hardest thing that autistic people have with driving is we don't have a theory of mind of the other driver, so if they pull up, we can't tell whether they're going to go or not. Like, we assume they're always going to follow the rules completely, so if they're sitting there, they're not going to jump in front of us, right? Now, these Waymos, you know, they kind of, if everything was a Waymo, then an autistic person could probably drive. But this rig is set up to test you on that kind of thing, and it has a heart rate monitor, an eye tracking thing, and they're having a lot of success teaching autistic people to drive. So this is a way to push people into the neurotypical world using technology. So that's encouraging to me. I'll skip Jack here for a second. Now, another thing, of course, as I've said, is connecting with people over their special interests. And this is a philosopher at the University of Chicago named Agnes Callard. There's a huge New Yorker profile on her. Her book is Open Socrates, which I highly recommend. And it's very autistic because most philosophers read Socrates ironically. That means thinking that he means something different than what he's actually saying. This is a whole book about how to take Socrates completely literally, all right? And it says very different things if you do it, but basically Agnes told me, I said, you know, how did you form your relationship with your husband? She said, well, we're both interested in Aristotle, and when we realized we were in love, we realized we'd never talked about anything about Aristotle with each other. Now, her husband's completely neurotypical. He's just very interested in Aristotle. But she also says, I wish if I'd been diagnosed earlier, I could have figured that out faster instead of trial and error. And I always say, you know, people, I was better off without a diagnosis as a child. I was better off without a diagnosis as a young faculty member. But it would have been great if a bird came in and dropped this thing on me right before I went into management, said, hey, you've got a lot of autistic traits and you need to think about this before you go on this adventure of yours. But of course, none of us are going to get our diagnosis at exactly the right time because we have to be struggling in order to get one, right? So that's another thing for your study, right? But lots of the famous autistic people have had neurotypical partners, right? Bill Gates had Steve Ballmer. This is from the movie, but Temple Grandin had the science teacher that took an interest in her. I had my neurotypical partners. Agnes Callard has a neurotypical husband. Dan Aykroyd had John Belushi and Bill Murray. And Carl the Collector has his friends. John Robeson had Ace Frehley. And so if one solution to this is to select the autistic partners that you can trust. But the challenge is, and a lot of us, all those people that I just showed you, we had late diagnosis. We either had, you know, moderate challenges or a slight speech delay. We had resources and support. We had no intellectual disability. We found partners who wanted to understand us. I sent all my best friends the AQ, and the highest that any of them got was a 12. All right, so I have been very fortunate and I guess able to find neurotypical partners in life. But the challenge is autistic people, just like Joseph and Jacob, are easily deceived and manipulated. We really struggle online because we can't tell what somebody means when they just write a text. and our actions are often misinterpreted. So again, you want people to seek neurotypical partners, but you could also cause a lot of trouble pushing people to do that. All right, and then finally with the masking, as you heard earlier, Simon Baron-Cohen said, would I rather live next to, who would I like to live next door to, an autistic person, because someone who was the reverse would be somebody with an antisocial personality disorder if they had high cognitive empathy and low affective empathy. I'd rather live next to somebody with the opposite, because all I have to do is tell them how I'm feeling. And then once they know that, they're going to be a great neighbor. As he said here, the antisocial person would make a great politician. No idea who we happen to be talking about there. And so you have this trade-off between, these are all feedback I get all the time. I'm incredibly sincere, straight shooter. I see things other people don't see. I can get things done. I have anxiety about not making a decision. So if somebody wants to do something, I usually say, let's try it. How many times have I done that with you, McCall? Yeah, I never go, oh, that might not work. Let me think about it. I never do that. I always say, I trust McCall. So if she comes to me with an idea, I was like, sure, let's try it. So I'm always trying to eliminate uncertainty, and I have high affective empathy. But on the other side, you have people who can give a much more commanding performance than I can. They can have this vulnerability, whatever that is, that Brené Brown thinks we all should have. That's terrible advice for an autistic person. Don't ever tell an autistic person to read Brené Brown or Daniel Goleman. All right, Daniel Goleman's going to make us feel terrible because we can't read nonverbal cues, and Brené Brown's going to push people to be vulnerable in a way that's just going to get them into serious trouble. So we don't have the ablest form of emotional intelligence. We have a hard time with nuance. We have a hard time being confident in the face of uncertainty, and we definitely don't have cognitive empathy. So how far should we push people across this? I think these are pretty good traits, and now that I've disclosed, I like just hanging out over here. But if I wanted to stay the chancellor of UNC Chapel Hill, I would have had to have cultivated all of these things, which I probably could have done if I wanted to bad enough. And then of course, finally, the neurotypical world should adapt more, because we want autistic people to thrive, not take money out of and resources out of the system. So we have more employed autistic people. That's better for everyone. It's of course also the right thing to do, because these are human beings who deserve to thrive. We can make it so that more autistic people can participate. Like, why are autistic people stressed out and need a diagnosis? Well, partly because the neurotypical world is making us feel stressed out about our traits. So I always say to like people in the profound autism movement, well, yeah, but if you constantly tell us that this is all in our head and that we should be able to adapt, you're creating more stress on autistic people, which is causing more of them to seek a diagnosis, right? Finally, we need autistic people in organizations so that they can be more effective. There's a leadership scholar at Vanderbilt named Tim Voges, who has actually, he did a lot of studies on these high reliability organizations that don't make many mistakes. And the idea used to be that mindfulness was the way to do this, because you would be all perceiving each other, and if somebody was about to make a mistake, you'd feel comfortable telling the other person. Well, yeah, except that mindfulness has a lot of uncertainty in it. So why not just make everything explicit? Then you're going to have an even safer organization than if you have a bunch of mindful people doing this meditation or whatever the hell they're supposed to be doing. Just write it all down. Just say it's okay to say, this is precisely how we're going to do this, and then you'll be able to include a lot of autistic people and you'll have safer organization. All right, and then finally, we need both sides, both extremes in the autism movement to stop doing things that make the other side mad for no obvious reason. And the biggest one of these that would make a huge difference is if people on my end of the spectrum would stop saying that autism is a superpower. All right, if my kid is banging their head against the floor, I really don't think autism is a superpower. All right, or if I'm don't have an intellectual disability, and I'm struggling, and I hear people say that autism is a superpower. That's not making me feel particularly good. We shouldn't just have autistic people celebrated because we can do things that neurotypical people can't do, like build rockets and start the home computer revolution and be the editor of Science or whatever it is. And the good news is that even people in the neurodiversity rights camp have told me that they think it's a good idea to stop doing this. So Eric Garcia is an autistic reporter who's written a bunch of books of this. He doesn't like the superpower because it gives unrealistic expectations to every autistic person. Lauren Ober says, I don't want to glorify what it is to be neurodivergent. Now, Lauren Ober her partner has a child who has more severe impairment than she does, which is a good thing. But she says autism isn't a superpower, it's a true disability. Allison Singer, of course, she's the leader of the Profound Autism Movement, who has a very severely impaired daughter. You know, she just hates this. But even Devin Price, who is the leader of the most vocal leader of the neurodiversity rights movement, they don't think this is a good idea. They say, well, this is something that people say at the beginning because they're proud to be autistic and they want to like feel good about it. But you know, it's something you need to grow out of because we're all human beings. So if you have Devin Price and Allison Singer both agreeing on something, it means that you should stop doing whatever that is or start doing it. All right, so my model for this is that you have three things. You have alignment, which is how far are we pushing our traits at a particular time. You have adaptation, which is how much are we managing the autistic people, managing their traits. And you have accommodation, which is how much is the culture accepting the difference and applying the double empathy problem. And every single one of these relates to the other, right? If you're better at adapting, you can push yourself farther. And if you're accommodated more, you can push yourself farther, right? If you're accommodating more, then you don't have to adapt as much. And if you're good at adapting, you know, so this is like a virtuous triangle here. And every individual autistic person can benefit from going around this triangle, and so can the society of autistic people. And so we need all three of these things, and it's a false question to say we just want this, or we just want this, or we just want that, right? We can't just push people more. We can't, everybody masks at some point. So saying people should never mask is ridiculous. I don't go to the grocery store and say, hi, I may not be making eye contact with you because I'm autistic, but here's my credit card, all right? You know, expecting the world to suddenly wake up and be completely accepting of neurodiversity tomorrow isn't going to happen either. So all three of these things, and I think science can contribute to all of those. That's my challenge I put out to you, and my challenge to the autistic community is to stop yelling at each other and worry more about helping everybody. I think the vast majority of autistic people don't care about that, but I just worry about them going down the rabbit holes when they get into this. And so I'll leave again, if Devin Price and Allison Singer agree about stuff, then it should give you hope. Allison Singer, again, she's somebody who thinks, you know, truthfully that the real autism is only level 3, like her daughter, who's self-injurious and has severe intellectual disability. But she's willing, and she still calls what I have Asperger's. I don't think she'll ever stop doing that. That's kind of just a, you know, that's a little bit of trolling on her part, I guess. But even with all that, she'll say about her daughter and me that, you know, one's not more important than the other. They're just different, which again, you know, is a lot of people would see as a concession. And then on the other side, you have Devin Price, who is, you know, neurodivergent is an identity that you can claim for yourself. But they say, you know, the brain science, the genetics, the research, biological aspect, these are all important, and we shouldn't be so dogmatic that we can't find valuable information in scientific places that are a little less comfortable waters for us. And the truest answer is a synthesis of all this stuff, a synthesis of both the biology and the cultural and the economic. So I like to end with that because that is a message of hope for the autism world, and those are the challenges that I put out to you. And so thank you very much for letting me come talk to you.
start at 3:30, and we have a panel. So if there are like questions, we can take a few, or we can do a break, and then during the panel, because Holden will be with us, and Alal, and Yair, and most of the people.
Yeah, happy to take any questions, or whatever your schedule is. Sorry, I went right up to the time. I kept adding stuff while the other people were talking. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing and new ideas that for me were new. I wanted to ask you, you know, there is this statement that a lot of mathematicians, I mean good mathematicians, by the way, I'm married to a mathematician.
Yeah.
This is not related to this, but I've been in so many events of mathematical gathering and so on, and the number of people that are different, I would say, and diverse, and feel so good in talking about this specific mathematics, you know, as you say, with the left guy and not with the right guy and so on. But it seems to me, just from observational, nothing, you know, scientifically, that there is a high, I don't know, high proportion, but there are many that are extremely good mathematicians, and they will, I don't know if they are diagnosed or not, but it seems in a naive way, I would say they are on this spectrum.
You're absolutely right. So there's a reason why, you know, you saw a picture of Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory as somebody who describes my end of the spectrum. I have some problems with Sheldon's character in some ways because, and I get why you do it for a TV show, but you can't be into Rubik's Cubes and Dungeons and Dragons and Lord of the Rings and Star Trek and Star Wars and comic books. I mean, what Aspie has got enough time for all of those? You have to pick some of them, all right? So that's one of my problems with Sheldon's character. A lot of people think that it's a setup to laugh at autistic people, but it's absolutely the case that people in certain disciplines tend to be on the spectrum more. And Simon Baron-Cohen has administered the AQ to people in STEM and so on, and definitely sees higher, now AQ, again, autistic traits are not a diagnosis, but because a lot of those people are not experiencing a disability because they're hanging around with other autistic people. So they're not going to seek a diagnosis.
This is why I like so much to go to those meetings.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting, and it's really inspiring in other aspects.
I'm sure they're glad you're there to talk to them in case they just, you know, are standing there awkwardly. Right. Yeah. And so absolutely, and music and, you know, Deadheads. There's a famous video that goes around about Deadheads who can say, you know, the Dead played this concert at this town on this date, and Jerry Garcia played, you know, a solo this way. And, you know, a lot of these things are absolutely true. You know, the Cavendish Lab, which was a famous place where people did at Cambridge, where like the early experiments on the atom and things were done, used to be referred to as Asperger's Palace.
Yeah.
And so it's absolutely the case, and you can measure it, that your math colleagues are going to have more autistic people on average, but whether they're more people with autistic traits, again, whether they're autistic or not is a function of whether they need support. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, you're right about that. And Simon Baron-Cohen wrote a whole book called The Pattern Seekers, which is a popular book that talks about the ability to be inventive and whether that was why the genes that you heard about earlier were selected for by evolution. Now, I happen to think it's more likely that it's because of eye tracking, because, you know, you didn't really need inventors, but you needed people who could see predators coming and were looking in places where all the other neurotypical people in the tribe weren't looking. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, first, thank you so much, because I think it's super important to have people like you talking about autism the way you talk, because this is super important, I think, for many, many people from this perspective to this perspective. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it's an honor to do it.
And I think that by the way, the AQ, the autism quotient, is now, we have 160,000 response from the UKB. So we will see. So we will see.
And we will find one with a zero.
Because most of the, when I
If you
show-
find a zero, let me know. Yeah.
That's a good,
Yeah.
because most of the people I said that were undiagnosed, they were 60 years old in UKV. I'm pretty sure that some of these people, if they were 3 years old in California, they will get the diagnosis. So
Yeah, right.
I'm pretty confident that they will get some AQ. So when I have millions of questions, but one that I think is super important is the explicit aspect. And, when I started the R2D2 project, we started with the people with autism, and but you know, when you do a European project, you start and it's a summer of Zoom to try, and then at the end you say, okay, we need to get the people from Autism Europe together, and it was exactly at the same time as Spectrum 10K, when the project from Simon Baron-Cohen was cancelled because the neurodiversity activists would say that no eugenism, no genetics. And I went to Autism Europe and I said, we have this project. And one of the women with autism, so it was a Zoom, and she said, oh, R2D2, you choose R2D2 because you think we are robots? So and then there were 2, 3 autistic men who said, oh, I like Star Wars. So that's
I think picking some from Star Wars is probably a good way to win our people over. Yeah.
I prefer Star Trek.
Yeah, I'm more of a Star Trek myself, yes.
Yeah, okay. But then I realized that the autistic people were joined, and they say, Thomas, we were not there at the beginning. And I said, I mean, you were there, and you were there before we get the funding, and no, Thomas, we were not there at the beginning. So I was fighting and then they were right. They were not there at the beginning, at the first day when I get the R2D2 ID. And I have to fight, and then I said, okay, you're right. And let's go to another question. And so now we are much more explicit. As you said, we are making 30 minutes break. I mean, Yair knows that. And for everybody, it's great. But to make a program to have 30 minutes breaks, it's always, so we have to make a book on what the people are doing. And it's great because now we have this for the report. So most of the things they ask is great.
Yeah, I mean, when we are pressing you like that, it's usually not because we're angry or even that we think you're trying to do something inappropriate. It's just that if you said, oh yeah, we're so glad that we brought you guys in early in this project or something like that, they hear you were here at the very first meet, like the second I thought of R2D2,
exactly.
And they're going to call you out on that.
Yeah.
Yes, because so like if you know, I'm very fortunate that I've been married for 40 years, and my neurotypical wife, you know, she says, yeah, you're like this, but you're funny. So that's her analysis of this. But like if we're trying to decide whether to go out or stay home for dinner, and she'll say, I'm fine cooking. It's like, I didn't ask you if you were fine doing something. I said, which one of these two things do you want to do? And she's like, I just told you. I said, no, you said it was acceptable if we're cooking. Yeah, which one did you want? Yeah, it breaks our brain.
And when you say blunt, you know, I told you about this boy with the duplication of Shang-Free. And the mother told me when he was 16, so he was the champion of France. So, and one day at the championship, he talked with another boy. So the father was super happy, so he said, "Where is the boy that? Is not there anymore because I said to him he was bad." and the father said, "But imagine, I mean, Ayrton Senna or Prost saying that you're bad. I mean." And then the guy said, "Yeah, but he was bad." So that's really that. Yeah. And it's a shame-free duplication. It's interesting how this dosage of these proteins can make a difference. That I'm still amazed 20 years after.
Yeah, in the back.
I find it extremely educational. I've never heard a talk on autism, to be honest. And I work in tech or whatever, math, and I would think that a lot of my colleagues might be, including myself, might be on spectrum. So I wonder what educational efforts are there to go to these big tech companies and to bring this understanding to the people who are not in the autism research.
Yeah, so I do get invited to a lot of companies and stuff to give this talk, but most of the time it's when the companies have already started a neurodiversity like affinity group or something like that. But no, one of the reasons why I'm writing a book that I hope is widely distributed, in addition to the fact that I want to see myself at the airport flying, is that I don't think, the problem with all this information is that if you try to access it, you're much more likely to get one extreme or the other in the description of this. You're much more likely to get, if the first book you get is Devin Price's Unmasking Autism, you're going to think that, you can't be autistic unless you're ready to say the whole world is ableist and, I'm going to fight this. Or if you get the other side that says autism is only when you're self-injurious and have an intellectual disability, you're not going to get that. So there's very little out there that you can access that will tell you this whole story and let you decide for yourself. I mean, if you hear this talk and you decide, I'm going to go be assertive about my autistic identity and make TikToks and, make autism a big part of who I am, you can do that. Or I think most people will go, whoa, I got a lot of these traits. Now I know where they come from. That's a huge relief, and that may be enough, right? And so, but unfortunately, if you go on social media or to the self-help section at Barnes & Noble, you're not going to get those things right now. And a lot of that is because most people who want to go do this have an agenda to get people to one side or the other of these debates. That's why explaining the debate is important, because I feel, because I want to keep people out of the rabbit hole if I can. Yeah, McCall.
Did you ever thought that you have it before you were diagnosed?
No, so when I was at North Carolina, of course, there are some very well-known autism researchers there that you all know, like Joe Piven. And there's a very well-known autism clinical effort that's much more in the social model, much more in the social model, called TEACH. And those two entities used to fight with each other enormously. And I spent a lot of time pulling them off of each other when I was chancellor. But all the kids that they were talking about were kids with much more impairment than I had. So my view of autism was very much, I don't know if you remember St. Elsewhere, but Tommy, the kid from St. Elsewhere, eventually met Jim Watson's son, who has, very severe autism. That was my whole frame. So this whole neurodiversity thing and saying, somebody like me saying I was autistic didn't occur to me until I went to a disability in STEM conference where I was just there to represent Science Magazine, and I met all these other autistic people who were like me, and I started seeing ways that I could talk about that. That's when I decided to disclose it. But the day I got my diagnosis, my wife was out of town, and I called her that night and was just kind of overwhelmed by all this, and I asked her now what she thought of that phone call. She was mostly just trying to get me off the ledge, but she said, I was really surprised that this was news to you. She now knows, what I said earlier, that autistic is the word that deletes all other words. But she didn't have any concept of that, because she's this very nuanced thinker who says, yeah, you stare at the wall, but you're funny and you solve problems for me, and we have a synergist. So she sees all the nuance of that much more than I do. Thank God. Yeah.
Incredible. And you were an amazing, so you can tell but I can tell you were an amazing chancellor. I didn't know you as well at UNC, but he was an amazing, amazing provost, and I was in both time when when you resign and when you decide to move on to science at WashU, and the entire university were devastated in both times, and we were like talk about it forever after that. Oh, we miss Holden, and where is Holden?
Yeah, well, the people on the inside of the university are people who I can talk to about my fixated interests, and so mostly they love me. The people on the outside of the university didn't understand me at all, and so that was the challenge I had at both places.
But I feel like you were a very effective leader.
Oh, well,
Very well regarded, very well.
when I had the right challenge to work on, yeah. I didn't go over this part, but I had a major sports crisis at North Carolina, and dealing with the sports people was something I was just horrendously bad at. Yeah. They knew I was the last guy picked to kickball, and so they were very suspicious of me. Yeah.
You know that Christopher Gilbert, the famous, he said that to diagnose Asperger, you throw a ball.
Yeah. Yes, there is a famous paper. Yeah, that's the paper you're talking about. Yeah.
No, I mean there was other paper about oxytocin when they did throw the balls to so
No, if somebody throws me a ball, I'll run away from it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they took it as a social. So for the oxytocin, they say that it was a reward for the person. I said, I mean, you don't talk with people with autism. It's not a reward to get the ball.
Yeah.
That's for sure. So they were thinking like a neurotypical.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, I'm wondering, like, how many of these ideas are portable for other neurodivergent behaviors like ADHD or something? You know, I'm thinking about some of the stuff you talked about, like masking and not masking, and when to disclose, and when not to if you have a neurodivergent disorder. Is it kind of like these ideas we're thinking about just in autism, or is it kind of like an umbrella of neurodivergence?
It's dyslexia, autism, lots of sensory things. Yeah, I mean, autism's big enough for me, so that I only focus on that, but definitely all of these ideas apply to these other things. I had a dyslexic student this semester, because of ChatGPT, I have to make them write their essays in class, and he just could not do it. So I had him stay afterwards, and I said, look, man, I have to be careful about this, but I can't grade this paper, and I'm like subtly building up to it, and eventually he starts crying and says, my parents wouldn't let me get diagnosed because they didn't want me to have a label, and but in class discussions, and once I started sitting with him and letting him do his assignments on the computer, he was just as good as the other students. He ended up getting an A-. But the first assignment he gave me was completely ungradable. And, so he's trying to he's masked dyslexia all the way through high school and gotten admitted to GW. I mean, I just can't imagine the toll that's taken on that poor kid. Yeah, I think about that a lot.
I think genes, they don't care about the DSM-5. They read it. I think
exactly.
It's crazy to think that there is one gene for one page of the book. It's going to be a cocktail.
All right, well, I've gone way over, so.
That was incredible, and thank you. And we're having a break, and then we'll be back for the panel. Okay?